Hey guys, what is going on? So I wanted to talk about how to grow your shoulders and the methods that I've used in the past and what I currently do to increase the strength and size of my shoulders. So very different from my last video where I talk about my triceps, which were a very stubborn body part for me. My shoulders, the opposite, have always grown very easily. And while you could just chalk that up to genetics, I do think that there's another element at play here, which I want to talk about. And then I'll go into the exercises that I currently use to grow my shoulders. So the method that I used in the past that I was unintentionally doing was, you could either call it pre-fatiguing or activating my shoulders. Okay, so this again was unintentional, but we would do kind of this shoulder mobility warm up before every lift that we would do when I was younger. As part of the basketball team, we had a strength and conditioning program, and we did this. I saw it as being like an injury prevention thing. We were never like trying to isolate our shoulders or anything like that in the sense of like getting jacked shoulders, but that's just something that we did. My shoulders have always remained, pretty healthy, so I feel like that is a beneficial thing. However, that led my shoulders to be extremely, extremely active in every lift that I would do. So if we would do, incline bench press, obviously that would activate your shoulders, but even just standard bench press, I remember getting such significant lactic acid buildup when I would bench in my shoulders that I couldn't fatigue, my chest or my triceps or anything like that. I had no idea. I wasn't trying to target any particular muscle group. Again, I was just under a strength and conditioning program. However, this is what we did. My shoulders, always had that activation. And so this is, something that I continue to do in terms of doing this, warm up, activating my shoulders, pre-fatiguing, whatever you want to call it. And so every compound lift that I would do involving my upper body, my shoulders were extremely active. Now, fast forward into the future, around, age 22-ish, when I started to want to build my chest, I realized that whenever I would do any type of chest movement, my shoulders would come in more than I would like. So I stopped doing any mobility drills in the beginning, and I just, started to do kind of a similar thing with my chest. And I found that my chest had a similar effect. When I started to try and activate my chest before my movements, it would over time have my shoulders do less and less work and have my chest do more and more work. And now I'm at the point where I don't really have to isolate my chest for it to grow, whereas back then I definitely did. And my shoulders have taken over less and less, although I think they're still pretty dominant. I don't think it's as much of the case as it was back then. So this pre-fatigue method, a lot of people maybe, they want to activate their glutes before they go into squats. That's something that I've done for myself. And funny enough, when I was constantly activating my glutes, trying to get more posterior chain work from my squats, well, guess what muscle group grew? So whether you think that the activation stuff is BS or not, I'm not claiming you have to activate your glutes or activate your shoulders or even need to do a warm up at all. I'm not claiming any of that. But if you want to target a muscle in particular for a compound lift, I think it makes sense to pre-fatigue those muscle groups. So this is something that I've actually been doing with my triceps. I'll just do like banded push downs, and I'll just kind of warm up my elbows and my triceps before I get into any compound lift. And I think that has had an effect on my tricep growth to some extent, although I do a ton of, obviously dedicated tricep work as well. So that's probably the main chunk of it, but I do think that that is a factor. So keep in mind that this is something that a lot of people do across a lot of different body parts. So it doesn't have to be glutes, doesn't have to be shoulders, it can be anything. And I've really noticed a trend when people intentionally pre-fatigue their muscles, and let's say they do leg extensions before they do squats or something like that, they get some fatigue going on in that target muscle group that they want to, really hit before their compound lift. Well, hey, that muscle group tends to grow a little bit better. So I'm not sure of the science on this, but this is just due, my experience and what I've seen from other people seems to have worked very well for me. So I would say that's probably the reason my shoulders grow so much better than any other body part. And, again, partially maybe due to genetics, but I think that's a very significant factor. Now, getting into the actual exercises that I use now. So I am somebody who doesn't routinely do this lift, but as I have shifted my focus into this specific variation, I found this to be a much better lift. So I'm somebody who is naturally pretty good at the overhead press. I would imagine that's just due to, again, bigger shoulders. I don't know for sure. However, I've naturally been pretty good at overhead press, and I've never really had to work that much to improve it. So it's something that I don't often do, relative to something like bench press. I'll throw it in there, and I like to throw it in when I'm trying to increase my bench and just kind of hit two birds with one stone there. but it's really not something that I do year round. However, I noticed last year when I was doing my slow eccentric overhead press, where I would, have a cadence of a 6 count coming down, I noticed that my shoulders would like get on fire when I would do that. So I would classify that as more of a hypertrophy exercise, and also really hits the upper back as well. But I found that doing slow eccentric overhead press, as opposed to just standard overhead press, I really feel my shoulders activating a ton, and I feel like that's a really good shoulder builder relative to just a standard overhead press. So if we're talking about overhead press in general, however you want to do it, I think that it does build your shoulders to some extent, but I think if you do the slow eccentric version, that's much better. And then another one that I found that I get a much better shoulder activation out of is actually doing a seated Smith machine overhead press. And what I like to do, as opposed to having the seat 100% vertical, I have it go back just a little bit, so I have a little bit of back support, and that allows me to get more of a stretch on my shoulders and just feels a lot better, like I'm actually targeting my shoulders when I do that lift. So again, Smith machine, you don't have to do it, but I do think that seated is superior to standing for the hypertrophy benefit. At least that's what I have noticed for myself. Now again, experiment, figure out which one seems to work better for you, but I do think that a seated overhead press is a very good way to build your shoulders. And again, considering you have that support, and if you're starting and you're unracking the bar here, you can actually get that eccentric, get that slow eccentric that I was talking about with the standing overhead press, and you can really get some good activation there. The only reason I don't do super slow eccentrics on my seated is because, believe it or not, my standing OHP is better than my seated. I don't know why that is. But that is something that I found to be very useful from the overhead press department. The next exercise that I think is very beneficial, this is for the side delts, but I guess it hits all forms, is to do Giga ROM side laterals. So that's just taking, as opposed to stopping here, when you do your side laterals, go all the way up. And what I like to do, again, kind of a theme here, is that I do a very slow eccentric. So once I get to the top there, I pause and I try and resist the weight coming down, and I do lower reps on that because it's much more time under tension. So I call those, you can call them giga range of motion side laterals, or I just call them snow angels because it reminds me of that movement. So I really like to do those, and standard side laterals are really good as well. However, as I talked about in my last video, I'm really a fan of doing cluster sets with side laterals, or you can just surf the rack. So let's say you start with like 30-pound dumbbells, do the side laterals, immediately go and do the 25s, go all the way down the rack. You can do that, or you can do a cluster set. But I think standard side laterals, if they're not stimulating your shoulders all that much, doing them in the standard way, I would say either surf the rack, do that method where you get a ton of volume in, or you do the cluster sets that I talked about in my tricep video, which, if you're not familiar with that, do something where you can probably hit that weight for around, 10 to 12 reps, do it for a set of 5, rest 15 to 20 seconds, and repeat that process for 5 to 7 minutes, and your shoulders will be absolutely on fire. So those are my two kind of favorite versions of side laterals that I think really help the side delts. Obviously, the overhead press does work your front delt, but it also works the other ones as well. And then my favorite rear delt exercise, it's only one, it's pretty much the only one that I really use, is a cable, what would you call it, rear delt fly. And I've found that if you do the machine where it's a pec deck on one side, and then if you turn around, it's a rear delt fly, I don't really like those. If you find that that works for you and you really get the best out of that, go crazy. What I found with the cable, I'm forgetting the name, the cable rear delt fly, what I found with that is I just get a significantly larger range of motion. I get a much better contraction when I go all the way back here, and I'm able to get a better stretch as I'm able to manipulate the range of motion a little bit more. So you can bias that to be more stretch focused or more squeeze focused. But again, I think doing the single arm rear delt fly is substantially better than the rear delt fly on the machine. That's just my personal preference, but figure out what works for you. That's the only rear delt exercise that I really use, and my rear delts have absolutely exploded. Now, obviously, pulling movements in general are going to work the rear delts to some extent, but for me, my rear delts have gone up dramatically just by including that one exercise. And then again, the couple versions of the side laterals for the side delts, and then the OHP for, sure, some front delt development, but overall just good delt development in general. So those are the exercises that I use. Again, that pre-activation, pre-exhaustion method, I think, is a very good way to get your shoulders a little bit more into your compound lifts. But if you're just going to do those, shoulder activation lifts, or excuse me, shoulder isolation lifts, I think those are going to be really good and build a lot of muscle as well. So hopefully that can help build some Death Star delts for some people out there. Yes, naturals can still build some pretty impressive shoulders. So I would get on that if I were you, if you are struggling with your shoulder development. So anyway, that's all I got to say about that. I will keep you updated, and I'll talk to you soon.